Go ahead and start. My name is Dr. Theodore Foster. Welcome. This is our final conversation in Black Study, a speaker series of 10 scholars who have joined us virtually, both for our working group reading on Wednesdays, as well as Fridays for this more public webinar series. This one is titled Making Black Public History, Black Political Cultures, and the Practice of Critique. I'll introduce the series just a bit more, and offer some conclusions for what has been a really rewarding semester thus far. So Conversations in Black Study convenes 10 scholars whose collective work deepens our understanding of the interdisciplinary field of Black studies across important themes such as religion, Black feminisms, gender and sexuality, Black and Native literature, affect theory, Black politics and organizing traditions, digital humanities, and public history. To quote Dr. Badura Lagra from University of Texas at Austin, Black Studies, she gave an excellent talk I encourage folks to check out through the Gilboa Center for Public History's YouTube page. It'll be linked to this recording. To see her talk titled Sunlight Through the Fog, Caribbean Thought and the Promise of Black Studies, where she states, I want to suggest that Black Studies rightfully holds an awe and Black study is to enact the break. Both necessary, but one holds us and the other releases us. Black study means holding the tradition, not to build new cathedrals, but for the purpose of eventually tugging at the threads until it breaks. And so we think a lot about this concept of Black study, and we're really fortunate to have the 8 scholars we had before to explore the usefulness of this concept in relation to the field of Black studies, as well as these other disciplines. And so I'm really, looking forward to this conversation in terms of how we think about Black history, public history, and what Blackness might mean for that form of disciplinarity to be included, or maybe to undo those disciplinary norms for public history. And so first, I want to thank some of the folks who help with advertising throughout this series, Tracy Monte, Elizabeth Rose Curie, and Amy Windsor for all the graphics and advertising on our website, which has a bibliography as well as more information about our other speakers I encourage you to check out. Our sponsors, the College of Liberal Arts, Department of English, Department of History, Geography, and Philosophy, Academic Affairs, Graduate School, the Gilboa Charitable Trust. I also want to thank my co-conspirators, and Ian Beamish and Maria Seeger, Dr. Ian Beamish and Dr. Maria Seeger in History and English, respectively. Y'all have made a really challenging transition after graduating with a PhD in 2019 to UL, very rewarding amidst the pandemic that's been, forcing us to do these kind of online engagements. But I think they've allowed us to really rethink how to be in community virtually in exchange. And so, again, this will be archived with the intention that folks down the road and ahead of us really find these speakers really useful in this dialogue. And so I first met Adam McNeil, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Rutgers, at a conference I just want to shout out named OSWAD. We discussed a bit of this on Wednesday. The Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora. It meets every 2 years, and I learned recently it's going to be in Ghana. Yes, is that 2023 or is that coming up? Yeah, okay. And this was fall 2019 during my first semester at UL. I'm fortunate to have had opportunity to go to Williamsburg and learn a bit more about your research. And apparently Dr. Amanda Joyce Hall was there as well. And so, this space introduced me to your research, writing, and experience as, both a public historian as well as very much so an expert in training. I'll just say, you already bring a lot of expertise, both of you, to the field. And I just want to affirm how important it is for us to engage our graduate students and postdocs as experts who bring a lot more to the table than we often think. And so it's very fitting that we conclude with your all's expertise. I'll turn it over to Dr. Maria Seeger to more formally introduce our speakers for tonight.
Thank you. I have the honor of introducing our speakers this evening. But before I do that, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Theo Foster for organizing this awesome series of 5 conversations with 10 of the top most cutting edge scholars in Black studies. We are so grateful at UL to have his expertise and his network, and our students, staff, and faculty benefit so much from his knowledge. And it's a pleasure to think with you, Theo, and thanks for allowing us to be a part. That being said, let me introduce our 2 speakers this evening. First, we have Adam McNeil. He's a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Rutgers University, focusing on Black women's lives during the Revolutionary and founding eras in the Chesapeake Bay. His scholarship focuses on how enslaved women were key contributors to the Chesapeake's culture of rebelliousness during the Age of Revolutions, which by implication centers the region as a critical site of slave insurrection and revolutionary activity during the late 18th and early 19th century. Secondarily, he focuses on histories of Appalachian Mountain slavery and labor histories in the 18th and 19th centuries. His research has been supported by fellowships from the University of Michigan's Clements Library, the David Center for the American Revolution at the American Philosophical Society, and the Alejandro Institute of Early American History and Culture. Of note, in 2021, he became the Alejandro's inaugural OI Audio Fellow, a new fellowship meant to present fresh histories of the American Revolution via the narrative podcast medium. In addition to academic writing, he regularly contributes to the academic blogs Black Perspectives and the Junto, along with interviewing scholars on the New Books in African American Studies podcast, where he has interviewed nearly 100 scholars about their works in African American Studies and African American history. I apologize. I have 2 dogs with me, and they're very excited about these talks.
We love pet
Please make sure that you follow Adam on Twitter at Cultured Modesty. He's one of my top people, most enjoyable tweets to read. And next we have Dr. Amanda Joyce Hall, who is a historian of 20th century Black social movements with a special focus on the international movement against South African apartheid. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow in African American Studies at Northwestern University. She earned her PhD in History and African American Studies from Yale. Thank you so much for being with us, Adam and Amanda. We're so grateful to have you here.
Thank y'all so much for such honestly a great introduction and a great week. I think one of the cool parts about the part about being virtual in so many ways is that it opens up opportunities where I've never been to Lafayette, Louisiana, but I feel like this is a virtual welcome to the space, and also the fact that I also enjoy that this conversation is through a public university as well, which I think is a very important thing, especially with pretty much most of my degrees and schooling being from public educational spaces. So super glad to be here, and really glad to be here with my great friend, Dr. Amanda Joyce Hall.
Lord.
Really happy to have you here, my friend.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way, Adam. It's great to be here. And yeah, I'm excited for the conversation. Let's get into it. Do you want to talk about your research first?
Well, we can talk about the research first. And also I think it's a good way for those who are not here on Wednesday, who didn't get to hear our great conversation, to kind of get into understanding our entry points to how we got here. So this will just be I guess our or my contribution to the first piece. So I can start if you want.
That sounds great.
Okay. All right, cool. Yeah, and also another thing, it's kind of cool, just like the webinar phenomenon where we see people here, but it's like we don't see them, you know what I'm saying? So I think that's still like the new part of Zoom that I'm still getting used to. But yeah, so I think that for me, as someone who has now been at New Books in African American Studies now since October of 2017, a lot's changed for me since then. At the time, I was finishing my master's program in Boston, so not far from where you were doing your PhD work, just up the road at Simmons College at the time, now University in Boston. And my advisor at the time, one of my advisors, Dr. Jessica Parr, was like, "Hey, I know that you like to talk, and I also know that you're trying to get into a PhD program. So like, how about, you follow up with this email I just received about hosting opportunities with the New Books Network." And I had listened to a couple interviews before, and actually, in a way, it's very it's an interesting melding, because the interview that actually made me want to join is from someone whose work I cite in a piece that I'm going to read from briefly. And so, and that person was Dr. Diana Remy Berry. She had recently had the book, The Price of Their Pound of Flesh. And, just reading that book, and, this is still around the time that I think the Nat Turner film was still kind of in the ether culturally. And so reading about what happened with not only the murder of Turner, but also the afterlives of his remains, the actual remains, and also the kind of like the way that his remains still fit into people, Black and whites, understanding of history over the last 150 years. And so for me, it was listening to that interview and really enjoying it and wanting to be like, okay, I kind of like this, being able to talk to people. And I was coming home from work, and so I was like, this is actually a really cool thing. But pragmatically, I actually wanted to get into PhD programs, right? I saw the fact that, hey, I'm going to get the opportunity to have my favorite scholars who I want to work with at the time, like Dr. Shawande Mustakim and at Washington University, St. Louis, Dr. Nikki Taylor, who's at Howard. You know what I'm saying? So it was just a lot of people in those early, lean years. And I say lean because if you go back and listen, I'm like, your ears might start to bleed. It was rough. It was rough. I did not expect to stay this long, so I didn't care to the craft that much. But over the course of time, I realized, this medium, and also with Twitter and engaging people, and then at the time, there were not the person who was there, James Stansel out of Houston, was transitioning out of interviewing on the medium. So when I started, and my first two interviews were Margaret, the book Dr. Nikki Taylor wrote about Margaret Garner, runaway slave in Kentucky, and also Slavery at Sea with Dr. Shawande Mustakim. Those books are like so important to my work, and also the engagements with the public, people saying, yo, like, then you start to become known as before my great colleagues like Amanda came about and others. I was really the only person doing it for a good year and a half. And I can actually say wholeheartedly that interviewing people on the medium not only fed me materially in terms of the amounts of books that I have, which are in the hundreds, in like 300 and 400 books now, but it's also because of the fact that I got to foster community. And especially as time turned and I transferred PhD programs from the University of Delaware to now Rutgers University, and then the pandemic happens, it helped me not only to transition into this new phase of my work as a PhD candidate, but also to foster community outside of my university and in the virtual space. Because truly through the engagements, it's also through thinking creatively, wanting to do roundtables, being able to do the roundtable with three of my friends, Dr. Hillary Green, now going to Davidson College, Dr. Ashley Lawrence Sanders, now of University of Colorado Boulder, and also Dr. Robert Green II, who's at Claflin University in South Carolina. And realizing, when I search when I'm searching myself to make sure my CV is updated, the fact that I interviewed Dr. Vincent Brown, that's on his CV too. So these folks actually care, you know? And so to me, it's just really cool being able to critically engage people's work. Like, I think that's the other part too. And it's almost a counter to the seminar space, like the seminar classroom, where you're told so often to like tear books down. And I ain't wrote no book, not yet, but you know, it's just also a pedagogical experience too. So that now that I'm looking towards a dissertation being done in the next year and some change, new books in African American studies and the 90 now 7 interviews I've done in these last 4 going on 5 years have really opened me up to opportunities to get published, to get get published in books now, to get opportunities, building relationships with agents, agents, and also people who are in the publishing space. And so to me, and how it connects to public history is important, because at the end of the day, I see one of my good friends, Angela Tate, now of Namat and Northwestern University here. And I think about the work that she does and my other friends, because I have a background in public history and public interpretation with the National Park Service. And the fact that how many times, like, do people just say flippantly, oh, you know, I just get a job in public history, as if public history is not its own space of inquiry and its own space of critical work. And so for me, I think about the work that we do as interviewers as a way to bring people into conversations that they might not necessarily get, because they don't have a classroom. Like my mom listens to a lot of my interviews, and it reminds her of like Black history and she says Black studies classes that she took at Baruch College in New York in the 80s. And so it's a way to bridge into unfurls memories that people have as well, while also supporting authors as well, which is important too. And so for me, and I'm gonna read a little piece later now, but in closing, before I pass the mic to my esteemed colleague, I'm really happy about the relationships that the network and and I'm specifically talking about network here, and we could talk more about, you know, where public history for me goes, but the work that we're able to do as public historians with the mic is I think very important, because we get to curate. Ultimately, when you think about folks who are in a museum, they're curating an experience for the visitor. And as someone like Amanda and I, we get to curate conversations, which allows for folks to not only learn, be challenged, and also enjoy, because you get to learn the history behind the book, behind the article, behind the canonical work. You get to hear about someone like Dr. Jennifer Morgan, who's Laboring Women, celebrated an anniversary recently, and I interviewed her, and the fact that you get someone like that who's a seasoned saint in the game, letting them reflect on a book that literally changed people's lives, opened up opportunities for people, opened up conceptual space around the world. That's an opportunity that we get as public historians. And so my work as a public historian has also let me know about my friend, Dr. Amanda Joyce Hall. So let me pass the mic over to you, my friend.
Okay, I'll just build on that. I think it's illuminating, like the way you talk about the parallels between curation of an interview and curation of like a museum or some other type of exhibition, because though that is what we do, I never like thought of it that way. So I think that is an important framing, because we can ask any questions that we want of authors, really. And for me, I focus on just kind of like, okay, well, how is this book structured? how did the author go about proving whatever this argument is that is in and around Black studies or in and around Black history? And I think the most, perhaps the most like generative interviews I've had, or questions that have like produced like really interesting insights, are ones that allude to like the intellectual, and I think you got into this, but the intellectual genealogies that people are inheriting. It's something that you wouldn't necessarily know when you're reading the book, but when people start talking to you about, you know, the people who were around them when they were like growing these ideas for their books, you really get to see this like broader genealogical work that's happening. So I thought that that was one cool thing. Another thing was the things that people do to get their archival materials, to get interviews, the things that people do. I mean, if you listen to my interview with Keto Swan, he's talking about how he is on boats, getting stranded on islands, to pretty much uncover people's stories and learn about how they resisted various forms of colonialism in the Pacific. So yeah, and I think that that is also something that's instructive, or it's been instructive for me, not only as a host, but as a graduate student, to just kind of know the different pathways to research, and how people got access to stuff, and the things that they were willing to do, the things that they were willing to do to pretty much get that information is also been very illuminating. So I mean, my experience with the network has been, or I think my main goal pretty much has been to internationalize a lot of the conversations that are on the network, and to bring in scholars who are working on Africa, and to bring in scholars who are thinking about diaspora, scholars who are thinking about the Black Pacific, and all of those things, which is part of the reason why, I mean, you know, Adam and I, we talk about this, but like wondering if the name of the network actually still fits the work that we're trying to do or where we're trying to go. It's like a constant question and point of reflection that not just me and Adam have, me and other hosts also have, kind of about the network, to really make it capacious enough to hold everything that Black Studies is. So yeah.
But actually, you know what, you bring something up that's really interesting here, is that I had mentioned curation before, and what that also means in its connections to like museums and exhibition spaces at large, but also in a way as people who are going to be in a space to help shepherd the next generation along once we, you know, move along with our careers, of course. But I think it also presents a way to also think about the network as your work is, right, transnational social movements, anti-apartheid activism. And it also is one where I have my own, you know, expertise, and everyone. So it's almost in a way similar to how you would think departments also want to curate their own space, right? So, you know, AFAM at Rutgers, right? We got to have a balance between early African Americanists like myself and folks who are doing the modern era like yourself. And you know, some people are more, you know, theoretically engaged, while still being historians, of course. You know, if you're talking about the history department, but like I said, you also have sociology, you also have literature, you know, so you know, while also picking up on what Dr. Sharice Burton-Stelly, Dr. CBS for short, and what Dr. Josh Myers said as well, there's also folks who their discipline is Black Studies, as opposed to people who, like myself, are classically trained in history, but are also developing, you know, their engagement with Black Studies as well. Because I think the interesting thing about learning about the history about Black Studies is it's a big enough tent to where a lot of people can engage. That can be a good thing, and that can also be a bad thing, right? But that is, and then this is the question of like the academy versus like what genealogy are, once again, genealogy. What genealogy are you coming through? Because UMass Amherst is different than Northwestern, is different than Berkeley, right? 3 degree granting spaces in terms of PhDs, right? And we, there's a lot to be said about that on and offline, of course, but yeah, so I think like, what you just mentioned actually just reminded me of just how I wanted to give an example. I wanted you to come on the network because I was like, yo, you do work that I don't do. And while it's cool interviewing people who are outside of your area of expertise, because I think that to know the Black experience means you need to know it in its most internationalist of dimensions. But it's also more important because the people who are more engaged with the outer reaches of that work should also be out there, creating their own conversations. Is that Paolo one? Yo, that was wild. Like learning about his experiences and then knowing that he went to FAMU, my alma mater. Come on, man. Come on.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, I think that this is where like Black studies and public history, like we got to figure out what's going on like as to kind of like relational things, because there is kind of like the public history that is that is pretty much produced through concessions that that universities and foundations have given to us, like after we complain about like serious things on campus, like the presence of police or the hoarding of endowment money and all these other things, and and they'll break you off with little public history projects and say, hey, we can use this as part of our diversity initiative. So I think that there is a weird also tension that we need to also address kind of within that.
Well, let me ask you this though, as someone who was also trained in Black studies and who has I'll be checking your bio. You've been doing like Columbia and yeah, so like you're doing a lot of good work. And so for me, the question is informed by that. So like thinking through the fact that we're coming now to 10 years since we are past 10 years since Trayvon Martin's murder, right, at the hands of George Zimmerman, and thinking about not only where we were as a country and as a space in 2012 to now, and thinking about the space that's been opened up, and it's like gross to even say it, but like Theo knows in terms of his work in the civil rights era, the question of spectacle, death, and opportunity opening up, right? And so my question for you, honestly, is like, how do we manage our not only investment in a certain way because of our attachment to the institutions, whether degree granting or funding, and the unevenness that we are in a way associated with those spaces, because opportunities are being opened up because George Floyd was murdered. So how do we manage that? Not manage, but how do we understand our level of connection to all of that, if that makes sense? I know I'm a great interviewer and all that, but I know it's not a great question, but hopefully.
No, I think it's because it's a hard question. And like we're all like implicated in this. So yeah, I think to reckon with it means that, well, first we need to understand that these jobs were created also through a long history of professors and students demanding to fund Black studies and Black studies research. to open up more faculty lines, to admit larger classes of graduate students in Black studies, to make it financially possible for those students to take up majors and degrees in the field by like not charging tuition. And for tax exempt universities to reparate Black communities that they're situated within. And those have been demands that have existed for decades. And over decades, of course, as I just mentioned, universities have co-opted those demands. They force us into these diversity committees, these equity, diversity, inclusion, equity committees, rather than funding these departments and doing any type of like repairing kind of work. So I think that it's something that has been in process ever since Black studies was institutionalized, and it reached an inflection point in 2015 and later in 2020. So I think that's like one thing to kind of like recognize about it. And then the second is that scholars can and who are seriously committed to Black studies, I think, at the university level, I think that they can recognize that the struggle is at the level of epistemological like insurgency. And it's always targeting kind of like the Western colonial university. So I think that, we can do this actually by studying and working with what Dr. Devarian Baldwin made very plain to us in his book on universities, which I interviewed him on the network. And my research kind of looks at this in the 1980s as well, which is like this triumvirate of university, state, and corporate power in this country. And so universities, like I mentioned, they're always going to try to deflect from their role, the role that they play in investing in private policing, which preys on Black communities, from investing in private equity to hoard billions of dollars in their endowment. And this investment in private equity, of course, like makes universities responsible for sweeping changes in the economy that produce the conditions of exploitation for working class and poor people all around the world. So, they deflect from all those things by feeding us things like these public history initiatives or whatever other kinds of diversity initiatives. And that's not to say that those things aren't important, but as scholars who are doing this stuff, we need to understand what these institutions are. And when they go out and they announce a cluster hire, it does not absolve them from their broader role in producing inequality and from supporting imperialism abroad. So I think our responsibility is to keep track of these things and hold them accountable and not just be appeased with whatever scraps they give us.
Yeah, and I think like that is so important because to me, I think about, I think she was in here earlier, but Dr. Crystal Strong, I believe, was in the room at Penn, and thinking about the work really in the last year that folks on the ground in Philadelphia, especially connected with the MOVE folks, and just thinking about think about the afterlives and the meanings of people's like actual bodies, right, and their fragments. And so thinking about that, like it's just it's just like it's still wild just to think that like I'm in Philadelphia now, and like I visited the Mutter Museum. I visited these local Philadelphia spaces that if I didn't know, like I might have walked past it and not even know. And yeah, so I think that it's just one where it just reminds me to your point why a book like In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower is so important. The work that Professor Baldwin and folks, I think he was like at the Smart Cities Lab and all. I'm just starting to think about all the times I've heard his interviews about the book, which is a lot. It's just amazing. But it also reminds me just about making sure that we keep, like you said, people accountable, because these cluster hires, like I operate social media spaces for a couple organizations, and so I've been looking at the trends and looking and announcing some of these job ads and just thinking about the fact that, like, what does it mean for a field when they're always being cross-listed with somewhere else.
Yeah, and that's my department. Yeah, we don't have a standalone AFAM department at Yale. And so I think that what it does is it like people end up like being in one or the other while only partially being in the other. So I don't think it's useful. I think that I think that there just needs to be a standalone program because I think there's too much slippage. And then with the slippage, there's not enough rigor. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I think the format should be, but other people might disagree. But in terms of that, I was thinking about for you, Adam, like what do you think the role that some of our like, you know, in this practice of critique is a practice, right? And you talked about how one of the refreshing things about new books is that you're not tearing down people's work as you're expected to kind of in a class. But what is our responsibility, or how do you see your responsibility of actually critiquing when there needs to be a critique, when a critique needs to be made?
Yeah, I think sometimes that's hard because I'm not like I can say like, and I can say this okay because, you know, okay, it's been recorded, but whatever. Like, did I like all the 97 books or give or take books or whatever that I've interviewed? No. But I think that it's one of those things where I think some of the best book reviews are one where I can tell that they engage that book, allow the book to breathe on its own, not to inject anything that it didn't attempt to, while also understanding that it is not my job to like it. Now, and there's a difference between not liking it because you disagree with something and something being blatantly and like racist or some, you know, sexist or like something that is beyond the pale. That is just not purely a interpretive or analytical difference. And so I think like that's what it is. Like I haven't gotten much sleep in these last couple of days, but I've been on a deadline. But like one of my good friends, like I literally like I disagree with something that he wrote in an article. And okay, cool. Like the overall piece was great. I just disagree with this particular part. And like that's cool. Because I think at the end of the day, we should not shy away from critically engaging people's work. Because, and I learned this through comps, Lord have mercy. It is okay to not like someone's book. You might be the only one, and that is okay. Like, it doesn't make you a bad person. It just means that you might have a disagreement. And I think sometimes doing that in public is hard, in part because we are not taught and or trained to do so.
Yeah.
We're taught to hide behind. Which I'm not.
Back in your review.
You know what I'm saying? But I think that there's a way in which that you can foster a space, and that is a space where that is the next phase, I think, of interviewing for us. Because I'm not gonna lie, I can't do it as a graduate student. Yeah. It would be, in a way, career suicide. But there are ways to ask a question that is, and this is where you get into kind of like the weeds of like interviewing. There are ways that you can construct a question that is open enough that allows them to answer it, while also letting you kind of be like, all right, let me ask this because I don't agree, but I just want you to be able to say it for yourself.
I agree with you. I have done that too with questions. Like the best way to do it, or the way I figured out to do it so far, as opposed to like directly being like, let's get real on this topic, is working it into the question and letting it dangle and then seeing if they pick it up or if they're going to play with it at all. So I don't know. I do think it's something though that, I think that is something that we can probably challenge ourselves to do, like in the future, a little bit more head on with the channel and with the network.
Yeah.
And then speaking,
No, if you don't mind me asking you a question, so we had gotten to this actually in Wednesday, and kind of like dropping a couple nuggets to get people prepped up and ready, primed. So, and this is based upon the piece that you had folks read, which was really great, informational, and all those things. And so for me, as a scholar of Black transnational social movements and anti-apartheid activism, stateside and abroad, I'm actually very interested in this, and this is in a way how we can model this kind of critique that we're trying to bring to bear here. So I read Dr. Sharice Bertastelli's review of Caste, a book that uses a term that is not specific to the United States experience of segregation, right? So I'm interested to know, in another example for apartheid, right? Because as someone who writes about, so like, have you can you describe what myths you've encountered regarding the similarities and differences between U.S. Jim Crow segregation and South African apartheid, and also how public history can be weaved in that as well, because whatever definitions are inculcated by what happens after it's quote unquote over, and how it's indoctrinated within history. So I'm interested to know your answer for that one.
Okay. Yeah, I think that bringing up the Caste review that Dr. CBS did is a really great starting point, because after I read that review, I felt so embarrassed, because I had done a backstory podcast like a year earlier, and I had mentioned like, oh, apartheid, we can think of it as a caste system in the sense that there's a hierarchy. But then after reading Dr. CBS's kind of like dismantling of that argument, I was like, whoa. I was like, well, first of all, I need to read more. And second, I agreed with her by the end of it. I was convinced. So here I was in this public history kind of like platform, which is like backstory, supposed to be this like expert on apartheid. And then a year later, I encountered this material, and it changes my perception on how to think about these concepts from like a more theoretical level. So that was just kind of like a journey that happened, and it happened in public, at least with the backstory stuff. And now here I am confessing that now, I have a better and more developed kind of like understanding of this now. That was like, I think in 2019, and here we are in 2020. So, my ideas grow over time. But yeah, I think regarding the myths, the first myth would be to just reduce, as I mentioned the other day, to reduce the meaning and definition of these two regimes to simply segregation. This overlooks the economically exploitative, colonial, and the anti-communism that was maintained through surveillance and police violence and incarceration for both of these racial regimes. And then another would be to is when people presume that the comparative lens is the only lens through which we can understand these two regimes. And I think that a lens that considers the intersections between the Jim Crow state and the segregationist and later apartheid state is actually more useful. So it's instructive to think about these regimes as two regimes that grew up together. And by that, I mean that we need to understand kind of like the transnational exchange of ideas, information, political, military, and economic power that produced these two states. And so an example of this would be like at the turn of the century, South Africa adopted literacy tests, poll taxes, immigration laws that were not unlike the Black codes, the anti-immigration bills that came down at the turn of the century in the United States. There have been scholars who've argued that like the literacy tests in particular were ones that were adopted from Mississippi tests. And then I also learned from one of my interviews with Chinua Thelwell that, the U.S. exported Jim Crow through the internationalization of blackface minstrelsy at the turn of the century. So there are these interconnections that that show, like how these two regimes, or at least power brokers within these regimes, were making international connections. So I think, that's why it's important not to just discuss the comparisons, but pretty much the making of a white world order, and how US politicians were in conversation with South African politicians who were in conversation with British colonial officials. So, similar things were happening at the same time around like Australia, the white Australia policy, and similarly in New Zealand against the indigenous people there. So really the onset of segregationist US and the South African states were a product of transnational dialogues of politicians who were seeking to create this white world order. And, what some people now, drawing from W.B. Du Bois, have called a global color line. So yeah, that's how I would think about that.
No, and that's great, because I think you wrapped up so much history in like those 3 to 5 minutes that you just like spit. So like that was fire. But I think also it's important because I think that apartheid is so close in terms of time that in a way I actually do wonder how much people despite its relative closeness in time, right? How much do people really know that it's almost like you are not you, but just people at large. And I've probably at one point or another been this at times too. So to show my hands, when people just flippantly in a way and blindly just make comparisons between the two without actually like it's not bad to make a comparison. Like the comparison in and of itself is not wrong, but it's more so you're really speaking 95%, if not more, about US segregation with a 5% knowledge base of a totalitarian system of degradation. And so the math ain't mathin', as they say, right? And so yeah, I appreciate that. And once again, the piece that you provided for folks, I thought was really was really good, and I learned like a whole lot. So I appreciate you for connecting that with people too, because it also reminded me about some of the things that I write about in the revolutionary era in terms of how Black people, and this connected to Dr. Barry's work, how war opens up good and bad opportunities in certain ways. And so in my example, you have opportunities that open up for Black people to exploit, to get free, or at least to pursue freedom.
Mm-hmm.
But what it does is Black resistance, and what I'm writing about in the Chesapeake Bay, I make the case that the Virginia General Assembly and many others like it in the war ultimately benefited from Black resistance, because when Black people are absconding, it's the militia, it's the state infrastructure that is pursuing them for capture, and by law they should be condemned to hang. But instead of immediate death, it's, I'm not gonna say social death, but it's a slower process to where the state buys them, purchases them from their enslaver, to then send them into the lead mines. Mm-hmm. And those lead mines are producing the ammo that is effectively trying to re-enslave them and reestablish the social order that's being destabilized. Mm-hmm. And so it's just an interesting way to kind of think about sometimes Black resistance and the death of Black people help to then fuel things that continuously reinscribe the harm, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I see where you're going with that. I mean, that's another tough question. To get into. But I mean, I do think one thing I guess I wonder just specifically in relation to your work is, unlike my experience to new books, your dissertation project had developed pretty much like in conversation with you doing all of these public history interviews, right? And like you being on the New Books Network and you being in, such close community. I mean, with so many people like beyond your institution. So it allows you to get like an understanding of the field in ways that other folks might not, because they're like kind of like confined to like whoever they're talking to in their institution. So what were there any particular interviews or conversations in particular that you had like on the channel that facilitated or helped you reshape the way that you thought about your actual dissertation?
That's a great question. So I'll say that Dr. Vincent Brown's book, Tacky's Revolt, you're a woman of Jamaican descent, if you don't mind me saying that. And I think it's a way to also think about, like, for me, I didn't really know about the revolt. Like, I had heard about Queen Anne of the Maroons and such, but I never had, I hadn't engaged that far out at the time. This was 2 years ago. And I just remember, like, and it means more now because of where my research has developed. And so in the bio that was read, like, I talk about the culture of rebelliousness in the chest. And then you find out that a number of rebels from Jamaica were deported and sent to Virginia. Now, I'm still trying to like find out in particular where, but it does just make you think about, like, I've just had questions. I've just had like conversations with myself about like the quotidian of Black life under the yoke of slavery, in the sense of like how did people educate themselves? How did stories pass down? What stories passed down? And in particular, historical moments, like for those rebels who were deported and sold to Virginia, what kind of conversations would they have had about the fact that their twang would be different than those in Virginia?
Yeah.
And how that would mark them as different in a way, but also how that can, in a way, be an entry point for conversation about why they're there, why they ended up there. And so for me, that interview helped me to also think about geography, and more immediate. The last one is Dr. Vanessa Holden's book, Surviving Southampton. Yep. That book.
I just got that book.
That book, first of all, like, I wish I had it, like it's like behind me, but like the cover is literally beautiful, and the book like is short relatively, but it packs a punch.
Yeah.
And so to me, the book helped because it helped me to think about, as I'm writing about as I'm thinking about how do I write about Black women who are encountering the state, who are encountering courtrooms, who are encountering plantations and encountering, mobility that enslaved people in other parts of Virginia didn't have. So to think about how would someone also write about a revolt that is so well relatively known, but still the true understanding of, and this is why it's important in the subtitle, Nat Turner's community.
Yeah.
Because it goes to show that the revolt is one that people know because of a name like a Tacky or a Nat Turner, but there is a community that took care of him, that literally and figuratively took care of him, right? That built him up. And so to think about what that also means for how we write about these important events.
Yeah.
Because it's a practice that has to be developed, but it's important to do so. So yeah. So yeah, those interviews were two of my favorites of all time. And I will say the Vince Brown interview was the only one that I could say that I was actually nervous. Like I ain't gonna, I was fanboying. I ain't gonna lie. I ain't gonna lie to you. I'm gonna say this to Vince, be like, hey dog, I ain't gonna lie, brother. I'm looking at you in the camera. I ain't gonna lie, brother. I was fanboying a little bit, dog. I'm gonna keep it a buck with you. I'm gonna keep it a buck.
I think all of us would be a little nervous about interviewing him.
He's a great dude, like a great dude, real generous. And we've developed a relationship like as well in these last couple of years, to where now I know like him and some of the students. And so to me, like, and this will be quick, like, because I know we got to pivot. The greatest single benefit of doing work on the network, of interviewing folks, is that the community that you knowingly develop, and those that you will either never know or will later find out about, that you never knew were listening. Because the network has provided me has helped develop friendships, partnerships across institutions, and it's a benefit, because when when graduate students tell me that, and professors and teachers say that they use my interviews or our interviews in their classrooms, mm-hmm. That's a usable pass right there. Like, I'll take that.
Yes, I use the interviews in my class, and I recommend them for students doing orals reading as well. Okay, should we, Theo?
Yeah, no, I was gonna wrap y'all up earlier, but y'all were flowing in such a beautiful way. Thank you so much. Do the virtual medium, but at the same time, you would hear a round of applause right now from whoever was in the audience, and I'm sure folks are clapping in their virtual or their homes or wherever they're receiving this talk. I have so many questions and comments. The page is full of notes. So there's been a lot of generative analyses, ideas, context shared about the university or research that I think will resonate with a lot of folks. And so we already have some questions. I just wanted to pick up on one point that Adam was riffing on a second ago about the kind of quotidianness of Black communities and Black life, right? This is why I think within Black studies, Blackness as a category of analysis is so critical, so that we don't ossify or flatten or freeze what we mean by Black communities, what we mean by Black leadership. It's always evolving in so many critical ways. And so your point about Tacky, Nat Turner, and MLK, these icons that often take up the space for our understanding of how it happened, right? I remember watching a really excellent dialogue between Fred Moten and Robin D.G. Kelley for a talk called Do Black Lives Matter? And Moten just reflected on a really simple question: how did it happen, right? How did the Civil Rights Movement, how did the Black Freedom Movement happen, right? We know it wasn't the mythological kind of like, Black charismatic male leader who just led the people out of their darkness, right? And he talks about, how Black folks built networks to feed themselves, to educate themselves, transportation, and often Black women, right? It was women's political councils in Montgomery that got 40,000 letters out in 2 days to enact a boycott that lasted a whole year plus, right? And so how does that happen? Not conventional way that we think. And so if Black study allows us to think about, Black studies and your research in a really critical light, then I think we really have to sit with that kind of everyday context of Black life that is really central to Black studies. And so I think we have a Q&A in the chat from Dr. Beamish that I want to go to, because he had a question from Wednesday but had to run. So I'll start here and then work our way down. I think we have these questions already populated. So I'm glad to see folks are engaged. Dr. Beamish says, do you see a difference between work produced by academic or guild-trained public historians working within their structures and institutions with the goal of reaching out to broader communities and public history work done in partnership / collaboration with the community?
Good question. You want me to start, Amanda?
Yeah. Yeah, I have to think about that. Yeah, you can go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Do I see a difference? And I think there's a general, and then there's the specific examples. So in general, I think that there are differences, and I think that the Ian's question actually reminds me just about some of our conversation that we had on Wednesday, and also some that I've just had generally about, like, once again, like public history. So like, what is that? Like what is it? And also like what happens when someone writing a 1,500 word article or a piece made by history from the Washington Post gets considered as a form of public history? I don't think it is, but I think that there's a way that, but I think that a lot of people who have not worked in public historical spaces, whether a museum, whether a cultural institution, or what have you, that you'll think that that's what it is. And I think like it could be like maybe at the lowest, like at the highest part, like an element, but I don't think that it's essential. So I think like that's the part that for me, I just have to think about and go back to people that actually have done that work. So like to give an example, Dr. Catherine Benjamin Golden, I read her dissertation or portions of it. And in her final chapter, she actually has a chapter on the public history of the Great Dismal Swamp. And so like that is actually important. She actually, I'm guessing that she used that as a way she has a piece in an edited volume through the University of South Carolina Press that came out, I think, a couple years ago, that referenced it, or that was about, the public historical element. So there are historians, classically trained, or scholars in the academy who are doing public history work that are like once again, my homie Angela Tate, who's in here, doing amazing work at NAMAC, I believe in women's history over there too. And so like to me, like there are people who are credentialed PhDs, and there are people who have gotten like master's degrees in the field of public history. But I think that not everybody who writes something that's quote unquote public is a public historian, or even contributing to like a movie, like as a consultant. That ain't necessarily public history. It could be, but I got questions.
Yeah, and I think that there are, like as you mentioned, there are folks who are like trained to like think about how to, think about who the communities are, think about how to best present things in a creative way, in a way that tells a narrative and breaks down like difficult information. And then there's like us that we're just kind of like, we're not classically trained, but we're, just kind of doing it based on it's almost intuitive. And what we feel like, the people who we're interviewing like need, as well as the people who listen to us need. And I think there's space for both of those to like exist. And I think that they both have important roles, in our world. So.
Yeah. No, that's real. That's real.
Thank you. That was a beautiful point about how both can exist. And to return to an early point you all made about disagreement and evolution of your ideas, I think that's a really important practice of vulnerability. I took a class in Black women's history with Dr. Darlene Clark-Hine my first quarter at Northwestern. And one of the things she really emphasized was that just slight, she's somebody who really, I entered the PhD at Northwestern knowing I had a limitation, both in Black feminist thought for my 2 previous degrees in Black studies, as well as Black women's history. And at the level of writing, she just made a simple point that, all writing is revision, is in a state of revision. It's not done. And so if you take that kind of approach, then the kind of finality of a text, its circulation, how we critique it, I think some of the facade starts to melt away. And we can actually do the work talk about the differences because we don't all agree, and that's okay. And so Peter C says, could you discuss how the amazing public history you two are doing with New Books Network as scholars of Black history and Black studies can lend support to contemporary social movements in addition to exploring the history of them? I would say just briefly, their work on the African American Intellectual Historical Society blog, Black Perspectives, certainly circulates in ways that I hope and know are being read in different movement spaces. But I'm curious how you respond.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I don't think that anything we do on the network should be confused with like political education or, you know, like work study that should be happening in community and organizing circles. So it should never be confused or stand in for that. But I do think that it can definitely introduce people who might be like organizing or activist oriented to critical, usable paths that that might be useful for them to bring to their work study groups. So yeah, that's how I would put the utility of it for people in movement.
Yeah, and I think too, you know, I read, you know, I've been thinking about like Lerone Bennett and like the Institute of the Black World since and going back to like the 70s. And
Vincent
like,
Harding.
Exactly, Vincent Harding, you know, and just thinking about like the highest of the tradition and thinking about where we fit into that. So I think that at the best way to answer Peter's question, fostering community within the space is important because that's a launching point for that can be a launching point, right? Like Amanda says, it's not necessarily political education. It can be educational, and you can learn about politics and how, especially when you have specific people on to talk, right? But you know, like I agree, it's not like the formal political education that you get in movement spaces, for sure. Which in a way you don't want. Like you wouldn't want something that's aired to, for example, my interview with Leslie Harris having almost 66,000 downloads. I don't necessarily think that's something that you want to be out there in the world or on Elon Musk's Twitter. So you know, there it is. But I do think that there are great qualities of the medium that we can foster conversations with people, while also understanding in the Obama era, we definitely learned how conversations, although sometimes critical, do they really develop anything? That's always a constant question and critique.
Okay, Beer Summit.
Hey man, skip to the loo. Let me stop. Nah.
I love to foster conversation. We have one more question. That was a really corny pun.
I do what you were doing. Like you did the.
I'm glad you didn't read
it.
We're at 6:15. We got one more excellent question in the Q&A I want to read and then conclude for our series. Y'all have been excellent thus far. This is great. So Dr. Reagan Gillum asks or says, thanks to Adam McNeil and Amanda Joyce Hall for this rich discussion. I'm an anthropologist and also a New Books Network interviewer. I came, so if this question has been asked and answered, don't worry about it. I was wondering if you've received any feedback or engagement from listeners. Do you find that your own public status has been elevated from the podcast? If so, how has having a more public voice affected you, if at all? And, you know, Adam, I know you responded to this on Wednesday to an extent, but I think it, you know, gets at this question of our relation as Black scholars in the academy that Vincent Harding is wrestling with, that Jim Jordan is wrestling with, that Sylvia Wynter is wrestling with. What does that mean in 2022 after this George Floyd dividend kind of development of, you know, positions and monies, you know, that funds this perhaps?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's. I think we could have a whole like conversation just on that. because like to give an example, like I contributed to the 400 Souls book as a research assistant, also on the 1619 Project book. And so thinking also about the role, just I'm gonna keep it 100,000, like to think about the role of my fellow FAMU and Dr. Ibram X. Kendi in this, because I think it's also important to think about the fact that what does it mean when you get literally what tens of hundreds of millions of dollars to an institutional space like Twitter, I think it was, or I think it was Twitter dude. And also, what does it mean when you also are, when we think about what Black Studies can do in terms of think tank-esque kind of spaces, Institute of the Black World, shall we say, at its highest ideal, that could have done that kind of work too. And so what does it mean when monies are going to specific spaces and places? So that's also important too. And also to just also think about for myself, and that's an open question, as someone who's materially benefited with an iMac that I'm currently using right now, which is coming from those funds. So that's one. So that's in a way to answer, because my public profile has advanced because I've had opportunities to work with some of the biggest up and coming scholars in the game now, and quote unquote public intellectuals. Once again, we can have a whole conversation on what does that actually mean, and who would be the crisis of the Negro intellectual 2.0 to write that. I think is another important piece too. But certainly to the question here, it's the network has helped me in my platform. And providing me opportunities, which I appreciate, but also it's providing me the opportunities to interview people through the auditory, through the podcast space, but also to interview people like someone who she interviewed, Professor Gillum interviewed my friend Dr. Todney Thomas about her book, Kingcraft as well. And so those opportunities to be in conversation in the written medium is great, especially when people will pay you to do it.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. Dr. Gillum, I think you should be up here with us. You've done so many wonderful interviews, many wonderful interviews. And I just want to acknowledge that. I think that, I think that, I mean, for me, like I receive occasional feedback and engagement from people who are usually my friends. But occasionally, you know, someone in Australia will like listen to an interview and then reach out about it. I think that, my public status, for me, I'm like a little bit more low key and shy. So I tweet less and my profile is private. And so I think for me, it has not, I don't think it's like elevated a lot, but I think that opportunity is there if I wanted to like try to do that. But I don't know if I'm like, I don't feel like ready or like at that stage to want to be at that level of being that public. So for me, no, but I do feel like there is like, I do think having a more public voice has, it just makes you kind of like, think about what you say all the time. I think in the way that Twitter does, like in general. It's something for me that I just need to get more comfortable with. And I think it comes with, I think I'm doing a lot of also coming out of my degree. I'm also doing a lot of like re-education work just with myself and trying to like catch up on things that I wish I had read during my program, but actually didn't get to before I start speaking on things. To be honest. So that's kind of like how I approach it. And then Adam, what you said about the Institute of the Black World, I just want to point out that the Institute of the Black World, because I'm not exactly sure what Kendi is doing with his institute, but the Institute of the Black World was also actively engaged in radical social movements. Like they were in touch with the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. I've like been in those papers and I've seen the communications between them, and the Black consciousness movement was like looking to them. There was like there was like a radicalism and an internationalism and a commitment to the movement before the institution and before the institute. I mean, it seemed to me like within I've seen from the archives. So yeah, I just wanted to say that there might be a difference within there too. And then I think the market question is interesting. I think that grappling with, what it means to, be implicated in this podcasting like market, which is not what it was, Adam, when you first, I don't think it was like that when you first got into it. The kinds of ads that we have on our channel now are different than the ads. I mean, I don't think there used to be ads.
No, and literally the ads are literally like within the last year. The reason why we're now about to get paid from our interviews is because of a recent influx, which is pandemic specific. Like it's actually, it cannot be extracted from the fact that it happened during the pandemic.
Yeah. And so yeah, I think that, I mean, we'll see if that changes things. I already don't like when I hear a Hulu advertisement on my interview. I'm like, what is this doing here?
Or Netflix.
Yeah, or Netflix. So yeah, I mean, I do know that, our producer Marshall, like, he needs to pay his bills. But I also wonder how that's going to change the channel in the future. I mean, and maybe we need some transparency as well around like that influx of money. I barely even knew what the deal was with that. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I hear Elon Musk is really interested in transparency.
Right.
But a couple of things just to wrap up. Thank you all again for this excellent talk. Amanda, you made the point about needing to read more. I'll never forget one of the scholars who really impacted my research on diaspora and Afro-Latin America, Dr. Alex Wahalia, made that statement in conjunction, Adam, with someone who did that update of the crisis of the Negro intellectual, and Hortense Spillers, right? In 94 has the crisis of the Negro intellectual, a post-date, which I think carries this theme about what is Black study, how do we understand the relationship between the university, the field, and our place within it as scholars in training and really producing critical knowledge. And so I put in the chat this essay by Sylvia Winter that was also published in the early 90s that I think is really relevant here, relevant to the work that we're trying to do with this Conversations in Black Study speaker series. And again, it's titled NHI, No Humans Involved, which was a designation that the police department in LA used for young, unemployed Black men, right? And so it's a language of dehumanization in so many ways. Sylvia Winter, is writing to her colleagues and trying to get them to understand we are part of the problem too, right? And she writes, the point of this letter at the end is to propose that the coming of that distant day and the end, therefore, of the need for the violent speech of the inner city streets is up to us. The starving fella or the jobless inner city, no human involved, the global new poor or les damned. Fanon pointed out, does not have to, quote, inquire into the truth. They are the truth. It is we who institute this truth. We must now undo their narratively condemned status. And so that resonates so much with my own kind of thinking about Black studies and the work that we intend to do and what Black study might mean as a break from those limitations to seek something new. And so, Adam, I saw your hand raised. Did you have a last note?
Yeah, and I just wanted to say too, because I saw Brother Josh Myers in the room too, because this is also a way to think about just honoring people who've. Because I think one of the best things about doing what we do, when people reach out to you, and or you reach out to them, but especially like when you get reached out to by a scholar that wants you to interview them, that is one of the highest compliments you can give, because that means that you trust me to read, to engage, to ask questions, to curate an experience for people, which, it's cool if people buy the books, but I think like that to me And also when people say that they listened to an interview that, like, from mine with his, it was almost 3 hours. Now, I don't know if they read it. I don't know if they listened to it all at once, but just to say that you listened to it for something that long, yo.
I'll just quickly add on to that, like, and to kind of get at Antoine's question is that I think my favorite interviews that Adam has done, like, or at least one of the best ones was the one, and it needs to get more, like, it didn't get the listens that it deserves. It needs to get more listens based on our spreadsheet. But it's the one that he did of the Du Bois panel on Black Reconstruction. And what that did for me, speaking of taking people on an experience, and I also love the one that you did with Josh Myers as well. Like, that's like a close second. But the other one, it was like, it takes you on it allowed me to like fall in love with Black Reconstruction again. Because of how much the guests that you had loved Black Reconstruction. And I remember I read Black Reconstruction for orals, and it was like not a good experience, like, not because of the book, but because it was orals. And so, I felt, I felt like I got, what I was supposed to get. And it's like, you can barely describe it because it's a feeling. And I felt like you created that in that interview. So I'll just say that was my favorite one that Adam did. On that note, to close.
Yeah, everybody got to go get and listen to her interview with Davarian Baldwin, Benjamin Talton, and especially the one Palu with Brother Swan. Literally, I'm like, whoa, what? Great interviews.
Beautiful way to conclude. Couldn't encourage you all enough or more to go check out those interviews. The genealogy of this conversations format is a mentor of mine and SNCC veteran and Dr. Fanny Rushing, who allowed me the day after I passed my dissertation to do a group interview with Phil Hutchings, the last chairperson for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And it's her understanding of the value of conversation, collective group oral history conversation, to do exactly what you said earlier, Adam, and it unfurls memories and experiences and analyses that you couldn't do on your own. And so orals, the technical kind of context, that's such a sanitization of the kind of power of Black thought, Black study, right? And so it's been beautiful to see you all in conversation, because there's something else I think comes out of that we need to archive, but also be engaged in. You study to struggle and struggle to study. And so thank you all, those of you who are still in the room, for this excellent panel. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Maria. This has been a pleasure. I look forward to watching the recording a million times with my students. So anyway, we'll be in touch. You all take care.
All right. Thank y'all so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank y'all, professors.
Okay, Professor.